With global affairs seemingly being framed more and more in the American-Russian-Chinese triangle, Europe has to contend with the impact it has on its identity, security architecture, and policies. Is NATO still the basic political and military infrastructure for most of the continent? And if so, how does it relate to the Ukraine war and the ominous nature of Putin's ideological outlook? What is the future of Europe's relations with the Anglo-American alliance? How can the EU adopt and maintain a common migration policy? And can Germany, France, and the other countries respond to rising challenges emanating out of Turkey, Iran, India, Brazil, and the major regional powers of the Pacific? Good evening, I'm Jonathan Hassan, and this is the 16th edition of TV7 Europa Stands. Joining us to dissect Europe's state of internal and foreign affairs are retired General Klaus Naumann, who is the former Chief of General Staff of the Bundeswehr, as well as Chairman of NATO's Military Committee. Thank you for joining us, General.
My pleasure.
Also joining us is Professor Uri Rosenthal, former Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Netherlands.
Pleasure.
Mr. Timo Soini, who is the former Minister of Foreign Affairs and Deputy Premier of Finland.
Thank you.
And Professor Miro Kovac, who is the former Minister of Foreign Affairs of Croatia. Thank you for joining us as well. As we do every month, General, we'll start with you. How about granting us an outlook on the past month? What, in your opinion, was the most dramatic shift of events, considering there are so many currently at play?
Well, we are living in a world in turmoil, so it's difficult to identify one single point, but it seems to me the one event which I would highlight is the recent G7 meeting. For one simple reason, it clearly stated that the G7 are united, are unanimous in their support to end this ongoing tragedy in Ukraine. And at the same time, and I think that was quite interesting, they extended a hand of cooperation to China, if one reads carefully what they were saying, and also to the so-called Global South by inviting some of the leaders from India to South Africa. And I believe that indicates quite clearly whether the outlook is European or not. The state of affairs is global, and all what we do will have a global impact.
Professor Rosenthal?
Let me follow up on what General Naumann is saying. And I would say, if I would pick up some events which really strike me as being extremely important, I would go indeed southwards and eastwards and beyond Europe. And then I notice, for instance, that China has done this China Central Asia Summit, where it brings together these countries which used to be part of the Soviet Union, are now independent. Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan. And then even the situation that China is trying to get its direct connection to Europe beyond the Russian territory. And this makes for me a point which I already felt very, very heavily when this aggression of Russia started against Ukraine. It was immediately clear to me, at least, and I'm not arrogant about it, that in the relation between China, America and Russia, in any case, when we talk of China and Russia, China is the principal and Russia is, well, you can call it what you want. The agent in a principal-agent relation, you could call it a puppet, you could call it the victim of its own arrogance.
Mr. Soini?
Yeah, of course, Ukraine is an open wound in Europe, and it's so near also to Finland that we are following up it very keenly. And we have been waiting more Russian reaction. And now there have emerged some stuff also some hybrid operations to our establishments, and clearly messages that something may be coming. People have been going on to Russia by reloading their tanks, and I'm just waiting when it will be the first win held in custody in Russia, because Russia always want to have a bilateral conflict, so to say, because US is too big for them, European Union is too big for them, but individual country is suitable conflict for them. And I think that Russia will pick up some countries in Europe in that sense, especially their neighbors. Another interesting and striking part is the countries like Kazakhstan and so forth, because now it's quite clear that the Western stuff is sold to Kazakhstan and the likes, and then they are exported to Russia. And what kind of pattern and how big this function is. And sadly so, it does seem that even so that G7 is maybe launching a decision which enables even the fighters, airplanes to be sent to Ukraine, that this is gonna be long-lasting conflict in years to come. And we have waited quite long that there would be some kind of mixed feelings within Siloviks, within Russian Putin establishment, but there are no signs of that.
Professor Kovac?
Thank you for inviting me, Jonathan, to this panel. It's an honor, a privilege. These distinguished gentlemen discuss these important topics. I would say, like the general did, and Professor Rosenthal, that what me struck most is the G7 meeting in Japan and the clear stance, I would say, against China. So my feeling is that the major powers in the West, being the G7 countries, and that their leaders have realized that the West has to protect itself. Because we see now also with the war Russia wages against Ukraine that the sanctions do not work. This was my conviction from the outset, that they wouldn't work, the sanctions. We have China supporting Russia. We have this global competition between the US and China. We have this alternative when it comes to the G7, the BRICS countries, which now have surpassed the G7 countries. When you look at the share of the global GDP, 31.5% of the global GDP, the BRICS countries, the G7 countries, 30%. 40% of the world's population, BRICS countries. So things are changing in the world, and the West has to understand that it has to protect itself. And when it comes to the West itself, to the political West, my fear is that our system in the global West of administering things when it comes to global affairs is not efficient enough. Europe is not strong enough. So Europe should be much more aware of its role to be responsible for being what the Germans say, Ordnungsmacht in Europe. So we should be a strong partner of the US in the political West, but the European Union should be the major power on the European continent to uphold peace and security. It is not the case. The European Union was in charge of the conflict in Ukraine, Minsk agreements. It was in charge of the conflict in the former Yugoslavia, European Community. But the Americans took over in the 90s in the former Yugoslavia. And then the Americans took over now basically the crisis management in Ukraine. So we have twice shown as Europeans that we are not efficient enough when it comes to crisis management. So we have to change things. But our American friends, they have to understand that it's also in their interest to have us as stronger partners in this alliance if we want to protect our interests in the world.
Indeed. General?
Well, let me respond to the remarks of our Croatian colleague. since I was a little bit involved when the first European failure occurred over former Yugoslavia. In former Yugoslavia, we would have had a chance as Europeans if we had been prepared, if we had had the resolve to stand, if we had followed the logic which says you cannot recognize a country like Croatia but denying the protection. What the basic mistake of the then German Foreign Minister Hans-Dieter Genscher was. We have learned from that, and we Europeans know that we have to be prepared for such European contingencies. But Ukraine is a different ballgame. There we are acting against, in terms of numbers, the biggest nuclear power in this world. And that is impossible to respond to without the Americans. So if the Americans hadn't been prepared to act in Ukraine, Russia would have had its way. And that, I think, is a basic difference between the failure in the 90s and the lack of capabilities in these days. And there I think we have to draw one conclusion. The one is there will be no security for Europe, whatever will happen, without the United States of America. And for the Americans, on the other hand, that means that there will be no world powers position for the United States without the European coastline being guarded by the Europeans for the maritime power United States of America. We both have to understand that equation, which means, of course, that we Europeans have to do much, much more to protect ourselves, and that is particularly true for Germany, which neglected its defense in the past 20 years beyond any description.
Before we expand on the G7 versus BRICS, which I think should be highlighted considering the impact this is going to have for every continent around the world, I'd like to ask Professor Rosenthal to expand on, we just heard some taste of strategic power competition. To what degree is the European construct willing to accept a secondary role to that of the United States?
That is really a good question, because the atmosphere in Europe is, I would say, still, history, leaning on history, while things have changed in the last century already. And this is reinforced by developments in this century. And for that matter, it's for me very clear that, as it has already been said, Europe needs the United States. And and it is a nasty observation, I would say, that we need the US more than the US needs Europe. And so it is not a equation which is really two-sided in many ways.
Even though the Americans don't necessarily agree with you, considering the fact that they always highlight partners and allies as their strongest tool against China in that context.
Yes, because of course they love to have the Europeans on board. But let's face it, when we look at the defense expenditures, General Naumann was mentioning it already, I would say that I now already see in my country and some other countries that the very big expenditures which have been made in the Ukraine-Russian war, that some of, in my country at least, I noticed that there are quite some objections against staying at that level. And even so, while my country has not met the NATO standards. That's one. Secondly, when we talk about Europe, and we have within Europe two countries which are members of the Security Council and have nuclear arms, then both of them have their difficulties of their own. UK, Brexit, and a very bad economic situation, which is not going to be improved over the coming year. France is typically, Americans are always talking about US exceptionalism, but Macron knows also how to be exceptional in many ways. And then when we talk Europe, and our Croatian friend was very emphatic on it, at the moment, I notice, and I picked it up also from some observers, that the founding fathers of the European Union today are increasingly seeing a shift of a center of gravity towards the east and the Central Europe. And it is just a matter of time that when Ukraine is pressing on membership of the EU, for instance, the Western Balkan states will ask for the same. And that is quite different from Emmanuel Macron's statement that Europe should be strategically autonomous. And today he's even talking about should be sovereign of its own. So that is my appreciation of the situation.
Well, with that being said, there are a lot of critics of the current composition of the European Union, particularly, but Europe at large, considering the fact that many of the values that they always like to highlight in Brussels do not necessarily align with the majority of Europeans to date. And you have yourself, Mr. Soini, have been quite vocal about this matter. In particular, if I may quote you, you've said, among others, that we're not against Europe, we're against this kind of Europe, which is bureaucratic, which is centralized, which is undemocratic, ultimately within the composition of European states, all of which have decided to do champion democracy as their chosen form of leadership, of governance. It seems like the European Union is taking this away.
Yeah, it's when I was in the European Parliament for 2 years, and then I chaired the Foreign Relations Committee, and then I was a foreign minister for 4 years. So every stage I recognize that what is the space actually the small countries can decide items and issues just by themselves. And it is going to be more shallow and shallow. And the one big question is that for the small countries, the requirement of unanimous decisions has been, in a way, the way to make an impact. But there are strong rumors, for example, now that the common security and foreign policy is heading to qualified majority decisions. And I understand it in that sense that quite many countries are tired to certain countries who are always blocking things what comes to different issues. And that has enabled maybe the Brussels and the central machine, so to say, to realize that there is now the moment to increase their power. Because we have two structures in cooperation with Europe. The one line is European Parliament and Commission. They are federal structures. And then there is a Council of Ministers which is represented by national governments. And there is ongoing rivalry between them and the twist of hands that which will go forward. But the big thing is that we need America. And when I was a minister, there was a lot of discussions about economical developments, TTIP negotiations. Nobody talks about it anymore. Now there is rumors that so-called green stuff is protected by US, and now Mr. Macron is launching a kind of self-governance of Europe in order to protect the big companies of Europe, not the small people, but big companies. And that may cause quite a surprises within European Parliament elections next spring. Because if there are, for example, the stories like in Netherlands, there was a lady with the peasant party who went skyrocketing up. And this can happen in various countries, because if people are fed up that we cannot have a say. But the big security issue is, of course, Ukraine. I fully agree with our colleagues that America is rescuing us again. They have rescued in the First World War, the Second World War, Cold War, and now this war. And are there endless pockets? How would we cope if they will be fed up with Europe? And then there are elections to come. Who is going to be a Republican nominee? Biden is, how would I say, modestly, not the most sexiest choice for the next season, but it could still be possible that he will be elected. But will Europe, Ukraine, or Europe as a whole have any role when new president is elected in the United States? Or is it just domestic issues in the US which make decision for us as well?
Well, considering the fact that Biden currently has managed to attain the lowest approval rates in U.S. history, I'd be quite surprised and quite worried for European relations with the U.S. if the American people would once again choose Biden to lead them into whatever horizon they choose. But I'd like to ask you, Dr. Kovac, when we're looking at the current state of play, something that Professor Rosenthal has touched upon in the past, and Mr. Soini has mentioned right now, the European Commission is the one that is leading the European Union rather than the Council of Ministers, which ultimately grants the leaders the capacity to direct this union of sorts into a particular direction. To what degree is that not counterproductive, considering the fact that this does once again contradict the interest of the people?
First of all, I would say that we have a consensus when it comes to the importance of the partnership with the US. Without the US, we in Croatia wouldn't have had the possibility to liberate ourselves, our country. So we did it because we had the support of the US, the informal support, not the official. We did on our own in 1995. But Mrs. von der Leyen, she's a very smart lady. She apparently managed to build up a very efficient relationship with Mr. Biden. And that helps her to play that role. Also now when it comes to the war Russia wages against Ukraine, I understand that les chefs, as they call the prime ministers and the leaders of the European Union, are not very happy with that, but that's reality. But right now there is no choice. I mean, even if Mr. Trump were president and she, with Mrs. von der Leyen as president of the European Commission and having that American policy towards Ukraine, we would have this kind of partnership between the Commission and the US. That may change with Mr. Trump. But nonetheless, I insist upon the idea that the US will need, in the long run, a much more emancipated European Union. Because we have to take much more care of ourselves and of our security on the continent, while, of course, keeping the relationship with the US, which is crucial, which is essential. It would be crazy to go for a autonomous European policy. It wouldn't work. There would be no consensus because the French would like it, for instance, the Germans wouldn't accept it, the Poles wouldn't accept it, so it is not possible to carry out. It is not possible. It's a nice idea, I understand the idea, you cannot carry it out, this idea by Mr. Macron, And to conclude, when Mr. Trump was very aggressive when it comes to defense spending, I said, look, I mean, this is a chance for the European Union to become be more emancipated, because he's right. We have to spend much more on defense. And if we spend more on defense, we will have a word to say. Because if you don't spend enough on defense, and you only expect from the Americans to spend on defense on Europe, it doesn't make sense. So you spend more and you have a word to say. Unfortunately, it didn't happen. Because what is going on? Europe, or the European Union, the major countries have to reappropriate the capacity to act strategically, a capacity which was more or less lost after World War II. After World War I, there was already a problem, but after World War II, this capacity to act, to think strategically, disappeared. And just to say to share a final thought, the idea of a defense community in 1954 was proposed by the Americans. Even the idea of creating a European community was an American idea. But the French, they voted in the Assemblée Générale against the idea of rearming Germany. Because the Americans wanted a European defense community. The French were against in 1954. And then the Americans were fed up and said, okay, no problem, we don't care. We'll take the Germans into NATO. We don't care about defense community anymore.
Konrad Adenauer was very happy for that, since that opened the door towards the United States of America.
Well, General, ultimately, when we're looking at this framework, obviously there are going to be a lot of challenges that Europe is going to encounter, regardless of what path it chooses. But one point is clear: its eastern flank continues to be vulnerable, and the challenge that Europe faces on its eastern flank has to do with the emergence of a new world order in light of the political and legal implications of Russia's invasion into Ukraine. How can Europe deal with such a reality when ultimately it's not going to be the deciding factor to the outcome of that reality?
Well, first of all, I would say, looking at the debate we had so far, we didn't mention one point which will remain the real crucial point. Strategy is decided upon geostrategic factors. And the one geostrategic factor which will remain and which is unchangeable is there is no security for Europe without being capable of controlling the Atlantic. Having said that, it is for us Europeans indispensable to be allied to the United States of America. Without that, no security at all. In order to achieve that, since alliances are not based on friendship or notions of values and convictions, they are based on interests. And the Americans have one interest which ties us to the Europeans. We have to take care of the European continent. And we can do that, and we have to do it. There is no doubt the main focus is now on the Eastern Front. And we have to be sure that, or we have to be capable of protecting ourselves against Russia. That will remain I think, the point of main emphasis for the years to come. And it will take us years. And we Europeans, I think, should try to get our acts together. Not continue like we do it right now, to have 6 different aircraft produced by 6 different European companies, which is ridiculous. Not to have a dozen of tanks and what have you. If we were able to get our acts together, we could save year by year approximately 10 to 20 billions, which we waste right now by this variety of national egoisms. If we did this, if we brought our capabilities together, we would remain an ally which the Americans would value. And this brings me to Monsieur Macron, who obviously didn't quite understand what autonomy really means for European strategy. To state after he has left Beijing that the Europeans should not care about situation in the Indo-Pacific Ocean means that he hadn't understood that strategy for Europe means to think globally. We cannot turn our back if the Strait of Malacca, through which 44% of our trade is going, will be in danger. So we have to be prepared there. And if we are willing to be a reliable partner of the United States of America in that part of the world as well, they will appreciate that. And this would enable both of us, Europe and the Americans, to find a solution for the conflict with China without ending up in a conflict and in war. And I think that's what's at stake. And that we should understand. If we did this, we have all options open for Europe, and I think we still have a chance.
With regard to saving money, I'm sure that the European Union can find plenty of avenues where to save from, particularly when we're speaking about joint manufacturing of weaponry. I'm not sure whether nations would be willing to forego that reality. But let's take the Netherlands and Germany as an example. Obviously, two militaries are seemingly integrating into one another, which now both nations are going to rely on one holistic force. Is that something that will not impair the national sovereignty of the Netherlands? If we, of course, take into account the fact that the Netherlands, under its current constitution, Article 91, if I'm not mistaken, already forego its own sovereignty, and whatever happens in Brussels ultimately impacts decision-making in the Netherlands in its entirety?
That last point is definitely true.
So the first point
my country has decided a long time ago already that international law, international treaties are superior to our national law. And we are, for that matter, sovereignty is sovereignty for a large part with some reservations. Now, with regard to the fact that our armed forces are very, very heavily connected now to the Bundeswehr and even integrating our military units within.
I was at the beginning of this process.
So that is accepted full-heartedly in my country at this moment. So that's not the case. But let's take another level. Let's look at two other points, I would say. First, it was already mentioned, when it is about Europe, it is difficult for a population in the Netherlands and also in other member states to see that the European Commission, which is a kind of semi-political and semi-bureaucratic kind of entity, that it actually, in the daily affairs of Europe, is definitely preceding the European Council, which it was here mentioned, and it is to me a very unpleasant observation, which is considered to be secondary to the European Commission, while this European Council is a gathering of the leaders, the political leaders of their country. So that makes for the fact, and that is for me one of the predicaments or one of the dilemmas. We can't now engage in all kinds of institutional adventures in Europe. But as it is right now, this European architecture, which you were talking about, is not to the standards of what the public at large in Europe wants to see. That's one. I have a totally different message about Europe's global perspective. Before the Ukrainian-Russian war started, there was a lot of talk about the danger for Europe of being, as it was called, sandwiched between, on the one hand, US, United States, and on the other hand, China. Now, what we see right now is we are talking about the absolute need for Europe to take the transatlantic mode and to be to work together with the United States. At the same time, even today, you see European leaders one by one meeting their Chinese friends for simple commercial reasons.
Yeah.
And when we talk economy here, the interests of the United States and Europe are not coinciding. They are, of course, a matter of fierce competition. And that makes it quite troublesome to say that we are simply allies to the United States when the United States take a very tough stance, economy-wise, towards China. So the picture is, for me, rather arduous.
And yet we see the Chinese coming into Europe and investing heavily in
Absolutely.
infrastructure, from taking over ports in Greece, as well as investments in Hamburg.
There are
and so on.
limits to that, and the European countries do understand that they don't have to, that they should not just give away their technology to the Chinese. In my country, our ASML chip machine is curtailed in its possibilities of exporting their most sophisticated machines to China. But this was done under heavy pressure from President Biden himself. Our Prime Minister had to come to Washington and take the message.
But, Jonathan,
Briefly.
one sentence. I think the one important sentence of this recent G7 meeting was that the G7, including the United States of America, accepted, with regard to China, the concept of de-risking, which is no longer a total blockade.
Indeed.
No uncoupling, but de-risking.
Risking it.
Yeah, right.
Mr. Soini, ultimately, the situation in Ukraine is a point that continues to trouble all European nations, but Finland in particular.
Yeah.
Your nation just recently joined also NATO. To what degree is this still a point of contention within the Finnish leadership, which is now reshuffling, so to speak, into a new, more conservative reality? Is there going to be a change of heart vis-a-vis not particularly Ukraine, but in the amount of support granted to Ukraine at this stage?
Ukraine is very, very dear to us, and for obvious reasons. And of course, on our flank, the security of the Baltic countries cannot be defended without Finland and Sweden. And now Sweden is still in the waiting room. It's how would I say? It's sad, and it's sorrowful, and it's even humiliating, and it's dependent on Mr. Erdogan, who could be re-elected, and this should be solved. But then I see on the longer run also the problem of the economy, because there must be redevelopment schemes to be done and fulfill. We actually do have to start to construct Ukraine again. We cannot wait for 2-3 years to put that in pieces, but we have to start, even at the risk that there is war continuing on that, because otherwise the Ukraine will be sliding to a country which is all ruins. It cannot function. More people will leave Ukraine. There is a population of 44 million in Ukraine, and now maybe 8 million has left already. If another 8 million will lose because there is no housing, there is no infrastructure, no schools, that must be acting. We must be acting the more rapid way that we are thinking. And of course, it's nearly a heresy to say that we should end up with this war, because we cannot now discuss with Russia, who is an invader, and the only acceptable solution is that Russia is leaving. And I have a feeling that they are not leaving very easily. How on earth we are going to end this conflict? And I don't dare to suggest that we are going to have negotiations with Russia. But look at the Pope. Pope has a scheme, and killing everybody is unanimous to say that we must stop killing. And then when we ask when, after 5 years.
Which obviously drove Poland to change its rhetoric.
Yeah, and this is really, really hard situation. And then I'm afraid that in Africa there is a new immigration crisis rising. If Sudan, Middle East is boiling, what if Erdogan says that the Syrians can leave? There are 3 million in Syria. If they would test the Europe, how it was tested 2015, 2016, it was a hell of a time. I was in office and 1 million people came throughout to Germany, also to Finland, Sweden and Norway. We cannot take that anymore. And still, we don't have a system, distributive system, so-called burden sharing between European Union states. If a new crisis emerges, we are there with the bare bum.
Of course, part of the legacy I think that Angela Merkel would like to forget, and she was the one ultimately who appointed Ms. von der Leyen, who currently is the leader of the European Union, the leader of the Commission, so who knows, her policies may yet stand. Professor Kovac, I'd like to hear your perspective on the Ukraine matter, but also from Croatia's perspective, considering the geographic placing and the significance of that within that context. To what degree do you see that as a dire challenge for the Baltics, but also in the area of Croatia in particular?
In 2015, I was in Washington for a conference of the EPP, and Mr. Pompeo was there too. At that time, he was a member. He was a senator or congressman.
Congressman,
yes,
congressman for Kansas, I think.
And I said that what we need is peace forces in Ukraine. So we should have sent, not we, right? The West should have sent, on the demand of the Ukrainians, peace forces to interpose there. It wasn't done. I'm sure that the Russians would not have attacked a second time with Canadian forces, British forces, I don't know, Croatian forces as peace forces there, I'm sure. We had the same thing. Of course, Russia is something else. General Norman is right. Russia is not Serbia or Milosevic. Putin is not Milosevic. I mean, the power Putin has as a nuclear weapons he has at his disposal, but at the same time he wasn't as strong 10, 12 years ago as he is right now. And the Russian military, and Mr. Kavoli said, General Kavoli, the EUCOM commander, the Russian military is not really affected by the war. It's still huge potential. It is now building up its military. Now they have become trained. So the major mistake that was made, to my mind, is that we did not send peace forces in 2014-15 to Ukraine.
Well,
it would have been completely different. They wouldn't have attacked Canadian, British, American, and so on forces. I'm sure.
Would have been vetoed by Russia in the
Yes, but it could have been a Western-led peace operation on the demand of the Ukrainians. This is my personal conviction, and may be mistaken, of course. And right now, I mean, the Ukrainians, they fight very courageously. Not easy for them. But at the same time, if you read, for instance, the national the report which was produced by the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, Mrs. Haynes, it is said clearly that it is not probable the risk or the risk assessment report. It is not probable that Russia will take over the whole of Donbass in this year. What does it mean? That the idea is still there that the Russians may succeed in taking over control of the Donbass. I'm not happy also with the rhetoric of the Ukrainians that they will start their offensive. You don't speak about that. I understand that they need to encourage their people, they encourage their partners, us. I understand that. But we didn't do that in Croatia in 1995. We didn't speak a word about our offensives in May and in August 1995. We just carried them out. So you don't do that. And now we are, it's the end of May. We're speaking about a spring offensive.
Mm-hmm.
In 3 weeks, we're going to be in the summer. So there's still no spring offensive. So it should be much more intelligent not to speak about a big offensive, to prepare it and then carry it out. But it's going to be quite difficult. You have to be sure that the Russians, and this is my personal conviction, also based upon what the Americans are saying, like Mrs. Haynes, Director of National Intelligence, last year, if Putin, this is the crazy thing, if Putin should feel that he loses the war, that he cannot keep the territories he conquered, that he might go nuclear. This is something we should not exclude. And if you try to think as a leader of a world power, it is unfortunately something we cannot exclude. And that's a big risk.
Even at the expense of alienating their relationship with China and others in the BRICS composition?
Yes, Jonathan, but next year we're going to have election not only in the US, but also in Russia. So if he wants to survive politically, what does he do? Does he capitulate?
Could I interrupt in this? Very briefly. It strikes me what you're telling, because last time we had a session here, I said that I noticed 2 red lines on the part of going nuclear for Russia. That was the red line stated by Xi Jinping. On the Western side, there seemed to be a red line when it was about Ukraine reconquering the Crimea. But today, I hear different stories to that effect. So, talking red lines, that is simply my suggestion. Talking red lines is a cumbersome matter.
And
that's just statement of fact.
General Naumann, I'd like to hear your point on this, but you stated once, and I'd like to quote you on this, military strategy is not just about winning battles, it's about achieving political objectives. Neither side achieved any political objectives for that matter. Is this currently a reality in which nobody is truly ripe for any dialogue in order to achieve breakthrough?
Well, we do not know exactly what Putin's real objectives are. If I take as his sketch of a strategic objective what he put forward in December 2021, the so-called ultimatum, which meant in reality to turn the wheel back to 1997. If that is Putin's objective, then we have to tell him, if we do not want to endanger countries like the Baltic states, like Moldavia and others, then we have to tell him very clearly, you won't get it, whatever it will cost. You won't get it, and you can't defeat the West as long as we stand together. That he should know. And at the same time, we should stop to deter ourselves by permanently saying we are afraid of nuclear weapons. If we really look very carefully at what nuclear weapons could achieve in this ongoing conflict, if we remain at the tactical level of nuclear weapons, it will not mean that he could win the war in Ukraine. He could do a lot of damage, but he could not win. And what he will lose is, strategically spoken, the same what he lost already with regard to Finland. He lost Finland as a if I may say so, neutral buffer zone. Now he has 1,300 kilometers more NATO frontline, strategic defeat. And he would achieve the same if he used nuclear weapons, since he would lose China, and he would probably lose India. That means the global south will disappear. But is the problem for me with Russia is, as long as Russia remains fixed to this idea of a new Russian imperialism, Russia will not be able to negotiate a peace. As long as this idea remains, we will remain in conflict. And that means we, the Europeans, the Americans, we have to be prepared for a very long-lasting conflict. There may be periods of standstills, of ceasefires, but as long as this idea of a Russian imperium is not gone, we will remain in conflict.
I think also about particularly the nuclear angle. If most countries would truly be that concerned, undoubtedly they would be a lot more eager on laying their hands on surface-to-air capacities, which I only see Germany currently pursuing the Arrow 3, a few other countries, Finland, the David Sling, other countries utilizing some, the THAAD systems and so on, but you don't see a widespread rush to try and materialize capabilities that would technically nullify this Russian threat altogether. But I'd like to ask you, Professor Rosenthal, when we're talking particularly about the Russian role, as you mentioned at the start of today's program, as a puppet of China, which you said very carefully, isn't it fair to say that Russia is playing a certain part within a broader strategy within the context of strategic power competition to allow China and its secondary support units within the BRICS composition? We see South Africa supporting Russia with military hardware as opposed to what it initially claimed and then the Americans refuted. We see India playing an increasing role in procuring certain elements from Russia and China, even though I don't really understand how that really works between India and China, but that's a different story. How does that evolve in your perspective?
Well, right from the start of this Ukrainian-Russian war, there was the story that Russia was being cornered, that was driven out of the international, so-called international community. And I saw different things. Everybody was talking on the Western side about UN General Assembly resolutions which were adopted by 140 against only 7 against. But I looked at the abstentions, and the abstentions were representing more than half of the world population. India, China, and South Africa, for instance. Looking at the BRICS, there is this letter R, the capital R, Russia. We have Brazil, which is taking its own course in this conflict, in this war. We have India, you mentioned already. China, you mentioned already too. So the idea that Russia is being isolated to the extent we want it to be is quite dubious. At the same time, I repeat myself, so I can be very brief on it. When we look at the Chinese-Russian relations, I see that Russia has done a very stupid thing in invading Ukraine, because it is right against everything which China says to represent, namely being a reliable actor in the world global order.
Well, we're drawing near to the end of this panel today, and I'd like to give each and every one of you a closing statement, brief, and a closing assessment. Mr. Soini, we'll start with you.
I try to be optimistic because this is what the people need, because we have had economic crisis, price of food, price of gas, price of electricity, interest plus inflation. People need hope, and we should be able to guarantee that there is still life to be lived.
I'm also optimistic. I think that the West has to be united, but I think at the same time that we have to try to understand how the Chinese think, how the Russians think, and that we should be very, very prudent when it comes to our own Western-made hypotheses. If we organize ourselves well, I believe that we will be still in charge.
General Naumann?
I also try to be optimistic, and I should say we should clearly say to the Chinese and to the Russians, we are prepared to talk with you about a new world order which would be based on the concept of multipolarity, provided we can all assure each other that one principle will remain the cornerstone of that, and that is that all participants in such an agreement will respect territorial integrity and will not change any borders by the use of force.
Professor Rosenthal?
Well, let me join in this effort to be as optimistic as possible and say that indeed it is by itself remarkable how when the Ukrainian-Russian war started, the Russians miscalculated to such a formidable extent the disposition of the West to stay firm and to be united. And we should understand that when it is about a global context at large, we have our democracy, we have to defend it against those who don't want to cherish that idea.
It's always nice to end with an optimistic note. I'd like to thank General Naumann, Professor Rosenthal, Mr. Soini and Professor Kovac for being part of today's panel, and I'd like to thank all of you at home as well. Until next time, from me here in Helsinki, have a good evening.